Zoharah, Dr. Simmons, before you start, let me just make an announcement, or a suggestion that everybody get the paper and the pen because you always provide books that people need to read. And I want y'all to really pay attention and pick up those books and read, because that's some of the problem that we have in this country, that we're ahistorical, we're apolitical, and that comes from not reading the right things. So Zahara can, put out a few books that we can read, and who knows, maybe we'll have a book club at the end. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm learning from you young people. Once I finish, I'll put them in the chat so you'll have them. But thank you, Faye Williams, Mama's Club, and National Women's Liberation Organization for sponsoring this timely and needed webinar on racism and white supremacy and white nationalism. I was earlier looking at MSNBC, and I saw that in Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm sure still going on, there were heavily armed white supremacist, nationalist militias facing off against unarmed Black Lives Matter activists who are protesting the killing of Breonna Taylor and the fact that none of the police officers who killed her have been charged or even suspended from their jobs. Not only are we facing a health pandemic, we are facing an economic pandemic for many of us, as well as an ongoing racism pandemic that has led to the deaths of numerous unarmed Black, brown, and indigenous people at the hands of the police and white vigilantes. Given that a number of these killings have been filmed by bystanders and occasionally police cameras, we have seen these brutal murders almost when they have occurred or shortly thereafter. The murder of George Floyd by police officers Derek Chauvin, Tao Teo, Alexander Ewing, and Thomas K. Lane has finally penetrated the fog of denial that many of us have been screaming about for decades, and has led to the formation of the Movement for Black Lives and all of its member organizations, including the first one, the Dream Defenders. Every episode of police violence against people of color lays bare the unbroken links between European invasion of this landmass, the land theft, the slavery, and the modern racially biased policing, and demonstrates the moral imperative for a radical reordering of the entire US criminal justice system. This is from the police person on the street to the DA, to the courts and the prisons. All have been shaped by racist policies from the beginning of this nation. The list of those killed is long and growing. And of course, we all say their names often. I won't even say them because of our time constraints, but we know those names. Not only are those who are killed on the streets that we know about, there are many that we don't know about, but there are others who are being killed in the brutal prisons and jails, where almost 500,000 Black people are languishing, most of them in deplorable and unsanitary conditions. The deprivations and horrors inflicted upon those who are incarcerated have been exacerbated by COVID, where the death rates are 5.5 times higher than in the US population. And we know that we're reaching almost 200,000 in the non-incarcerated population. There is a state of emergency facing Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in the US. But this is not new. Black people have been victims of racism and white supremacy for a very long time, since being brought here. Let us look at the history of European racism, institutionalized white supremacy, both of which have been defining characteristics of the American social and economic structures since the founding. White privilege was institutionalized in different ways in state institutions, in the economy, and in all of our associational life in our civil society. Hopefully, all of you know that this is true. Yet, even amongst those of us committed to real progressive social change, the ugly head of racism rears its head and disrupts and impedes our forward motion toward progressive systemic change. There have been many books written and talks given about racism within our progressive movements. Nonetheless, it continues. The mass demonstrations, however, that have erupted since the murder of George Floyd, with thousands of white, brown, Black, and Asian people marching in the streets saying Black Lives Matter, gives me hope more than I've had in a long time. The fact that more people in the US, particularly white people, are realizing that racism and white supremacy are evils that must be eradicated from our society if we are to build a flourishing multiracial democracy that most of us say we want. Many who are marching and putting their lives on the line due to COVID, the white militias who attacked them, and the racist police who attack those who are demonstrating. Many of these young people, not so young, some of them, are new to the movement for racial justice. This is why it is important for us to have teach-ins on the origins of racism and how the 1% have used white supremacy as a tool to keep poor, working, and lower middle class people from uniting across racial lines. I believe that we must look at the history of our struggles against the deeply embedded injustices in our country and how we seem to make some progress to only see the gains made rolled back a decade or two later. And of course, we're living at such a time now. The Trump administration and its Republican cohorts are doing everything in their power to undo the progress we made over the last 50 years. Why does this keep happening? Why are we unable to build and maintain multiracial movements and organizations that bring about the changes we so desperately need? George Fredrickson, a renowned scholar of racism, in his important book, Racism: A Short History, notes that the term racism is often used in a loose and unreflective way to describe hostile or negative feelings of one ethnic group or people toward another, and the actions resulting from such attitudes. He mentions how the antipathy of one group toward another is sometimes acted upon with a single-mindedness and a brutality that goes far beyond simple and seemingly universal feelings of snobbery or disdain that one group can exhibit toward another. Racism is not merely an attitude or a set of beliefs. It expresses itself in the practices, the institutions, and structures that a sense of deep difference justifies or validates. It directly sustains or proposes to establish a racial order. A new book that has come out talks about it being a caste system. And we tend not to talk about our system here in the United States, but that's exactly what it is. It is a caste system that has set up a permanent group hierarchy that is believed and taught to reflect the laws of nature or the decrees of God. In this sense, it is said that racism is a given, but that's not true. This is a humanly created system of oppression, and it has purpose, and it is to advance those who have the wealth, the means of production over everyone else. Growing up in the Jim Crow South, as I did, I often saw and experienced race hatred, which as a child and a young woman, I found inexplicable. I would ask my parents, my teachers, and my minister about it since I could not understand it, especially as it defied what I was being taught as a Christian, and I grew up in a very Christian home, that all Christians were children of God. And after all, these people who hated me and my people claimed to be Christians, I couldn't understand what was going on. Upon becoming involved in the civil rights movement as a college student in Atlanta, ironically, a city that called itself a city too busy to hate, and it was a hateful place, I experienced the full fury of racism while on picket lines, sitting at eating establishments, or trying to enter movies or other public establishments. The hatred was palpable and completely unreasonable. The explosive anger caused by our demands for civil rights in these places left an indelible mark on me and those of my comrades who were demanding our rights. And I happen to have been involved with Dr. King and SNCC, as you heard in my intro. And of course, I saw the hatred directed at him specifically by white elected officials, by the media, religious leaders, and the general white citizenry in the South and the North. And it too was baffling and frightening. The climax of the history of racism came in the 20th century during the toppling of the racist regime in the American South known as the Jim Crow system. African Americans were a long time coming to the end of the US's own brand of apartheid. And just to go through a little of this history, after the end of the Civil War and the brief period of equal rights for Black people during what's called the Reconstruction era, and having taught for 20 years at UF, I learned that almost none of my students had ever even heard of Reconstruction. But the Reconstruction period, which lasted from 1865 to 1877, in that brief period, we had somewhat of a multiracial democracy, but it was something that whites could not stand. So they began to systematically re-enslave Blacks under various semi-legal guises. Another book that, if you don't know about, I really recommend you reading, and a documentary on PBS 3-part was made about this. It's called Slavery by Another Name, and the author was Douglas Blackman. And it was an earth-shattering expose. And he tells us about the virulent resistance by whites to the full emancipation of former slaves and their resistance to any sharing of power between Blacks and whites. This resistance was so effective that it was hard to discern in many places in the South that the North had actually won the Civil War. That's how bad it was. In order for whites to reestablish their hegemony over Blacks, they invented an extraordinary campaign of defiance and subversion against the new biracial social order by organizing themselves into vigilante gangs and militias. They undermined free elections across the region. They terrorized Black leaders, and they placed the blame for anarchy upon the freed, enslaved people. Now, think about what's happening right now. We have white militias armed to the teeth that are being loosed upon us by President Trump. And I'm very worried about what's going to happen on November 3rd and leading up to it, because we could have a replay of what happened after Reconstruction. But getting back to the history, beginning in the late 1860s, every Southern state enacted an array of interlocking laws whose essential intent was to criminalize Black life. This is very, very important, because this is playing out now. When you wonder why do these police keep shooting unarmed Black people, men, women, and children? It's because Blacks are seen as criminals. And this began in the late 1860s. Every state except Arkansas and Tennessee passed laws by the end of 1865 outlawing vagrancy, and defined it so vaguely that virtually any free Black person not under the protection, quote unquote, or under the authority of a white person could be arrested for vagrancy. This was how they re-enslaved us. Mississippi went even further, passing a statute that required African American workers to enter into labor contracts with white farmers by January 1st of every year, or be subject to arrest. Again, the re-enslavement, slavery by another name. Other states enacted laws that said that a Negro could not legally be hired for work without a discharge paper from the previous white employer. So this, in effect, prevented Black people from leaving the plantation they worked on, no matter how horrible their working or living conditions were. And you might not believe it, but when I was growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, this was still in effect in Mississippi. And people had to run away in the dead of night from these plantations. And their first stop would be in Memphis, where people would hide them because the white plantation owners were coming with the dogs looking for them. This was in the 1960s. I experienced this. And when I went to Mississippi with SNCC, I saw it for myself on these plantations where people were locked in with armed guards and dogs. Going back to the history, in the 1880s, Alabama, North Carolina, and Florida actually enacted laws making it a criminal act for a Black person to change employers without permission. Slavery by another name. A national white consensus against African Americans arose in the late 1800s among the general white public, the national leadership of the Republican Party, and the federal government. They concluded that African Americans did not merit citizenship and that their freedom was not worth the conflicts that this freedom engendered among whites. It's shocking to know that in 1876, President Ulysses S. Grant, who had led the Union Army to victory over the Confederates, conceded to members of his cabinet that the 15th Amendment, giving freed male slaves the right to vote, had been a mistake. Grant said, and I quote, "It has done the Negro no good and has been a hindrance to the South and is by no means a political advantage to the North." This is Ulysses Grant. The racially motivated violence against Blacks was so extreme during this period that leaders such as Booker T. Washington urged Blacks to accept a deferential second-class position in American society in return for less racial violence by whites. I know I'm going over time and I'm not going to read my entire thing, but I, like Faye, was on the committee to change the name of J.J. Finley, a white slave owner and a Confederate general. J.J. Finley's name had been on that school for 81 years. And I was shocked to learn that there were some African Americans here in Gainesville who were afraid to put a Black name on that building because they were afraid that it would make white people mad and would make life harder for Black people. And I thought about Booker T. Washington saying that to Black people: don't fight for your rights. Take whatever these white people hand you so that you can live. So here we are in 2020, and some Black people could have the nerve to say, don't put a Black name on that school because it's going to make it hard for Black people here in Gainesville. Reflect on that. African Americans who chose to or were forced to remain in the South were caught between the proverbial rock and hard place. In 1883, on the 20th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, an aging Frederick Douglass said, "Despite the bloody sacrifice of Black soldiers in the fight for liberation, in all relations of life and death, we are met by the color line. It haunts us at midnight, denies us accommodation, excludes our children from schools, and compels us to pursue only such labor as will bring us the least reward." End of quote. To add insult to injury, the United States Supreme Court ruled in 1883 that the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which forced whites to comply with the 14th and 15th Amendments, awarding voting rights to Black men and legal rights to all Blacks, could not be enforced. So here we have the Supreme Court. You know, when people talk about reparations and folks say, well, you know, I wasn't here, white people who maybe are descendants of immigrants, and they say, I wasn't here, so I shouldn't have to be responsible for reparations. This is what the US government did. So the government is responsible because many of the laws that were passed by the Supreme Court really made life difficult and miserable for Black people. So it's not only reparations for slavery, it's reparations from the enslavement period until now. Anyway, to rush ahead, there's Plessy versus Ferguson. If you don't know about that, I'll put that in the chat too. That passed in 1896. By 1901, nearly every African American had been stripped of all political and human rights in virtually every southern state, and it would remain this way until the Civil Rights Movement. Now, many Blacks fled the South, traveling north to what they hoped would be the promised land, but here they too found racism, as whites in the North also viewed Blacks as lower caste people born to serve them. The myth of Blacks as the cursed descendants of Ham in the Hebrew Bible has been hard for Black people to overcome. Black people were associated in the white mind with the primitive, the backward, or the irredeemably pre-modern. The heritage of slavery and beliefs about the savagery of Africa engendered a white supremacist myth that Blacks were inherently an unprogressive race incapable of joining the modern era. So I'm going to just end on my last comment because I didn't turn my timer on, and I don't know, I think I might have run past my time. But of course, as you know, some of you hopefully know, many of us experienced, the Civil Rights Movement brought major changes to the US. And that's why when anybody says the Civil Rights Movement didn't do anything, it's because they didn't live like I did during the Jim Crow era. And to see some of the changes, progressive changes that were made. So the Civil Rights Movement did end some of the overt racism that was enshrined in our legal system. But the period that we're living through now, the fact that we have the growth of the militias and a president who is overtly racist and who, no matter what he does, still seems to have about a 30% a group of Americans who support him, shows us that we really have not rooted out racism. As a veteran, my last statement, as a veteran of the civil rights and Black Power movements, I know that the only way we're going to change this is that we have to organize a grassroots-led movement. And you can't ever stop. You know, you have to be vigilant, and you can't think that you've done something and you can go sit down, because that clearly is not the case. And I've lived through this. as a veteran of the civil rights and Black Power movements. To think that it's over and done is a terrible mistake. And so the challenge to all of us on this call is to be about the business of organizing, educating, mobilizing, because the movement for human rights is in our hands. And the question is, are we up to the challenge? Thank you.